So this week is ultimately about CS50 Shuttle, and I dare say one of the most exciting aspects of this week is that it is your last CS50 problem set ever. We like to think it's also fun. You will recall perhaps from week 0 that in problem set 8 you have the ability to start driving around campus, picking up teaching fellows, CAs, and a few Easter eggs along the way. Where did he go? Well, and when you come up close to one of the staff members, can you click this pickup button at top left or drop them off at their appropriate house? And there's also opportunities to build in some Easter eggs of your own. For instance, those of you who grew up playing Nintendo might recall the Konami code, up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. If you actually type that into the staff solution, you will also acquire the ability to fly. So there you have it, CS50 Shuttle, a framework for which we provide you with, and you then begin to fill in some blanks. So without further ado, today is about introducing the concepts and the techniques with which you can start implementing this as well as your own final projects, and thus enters into the picture JavaScript. So JavaScript is a programming language like C, like PHP, but unlike those languages, it is executed entirely client-side, generally within a browser, although these days server-side options do exist. And like PHP, it is not compiled. So there's no process of running GCC or similar with JavaScript. Rather, you write JavaScript code, you store it inside of your HTML files or PHP files or in separate .js files. And then when the browser downloads that JavaScript code, it executes it. So the CS50 Shuttle implementation is an amalgam of a plugin, which you did have to download separately or will from Google Earth, but also the Google Maps API, application programming interface, as well as just some HTML and JavaScript and CSS that we wrote. And we've wired, so to speak, all of these various tools together so that you can focus ultimately on the logic and on the usage of these tools to make something much more interesting than just Google Earth or just Google Maps standing unto itself. So a few background details. You'll recall we've talked about some of these status codes, 401, 403, 404, 500. Generally, these are bad things. If you are seeing this when working on some project of yours, you've messed up somewhere. Or if you're on the web and you come across a 404, it means someone else has messed up. And just to be clear as to where these messages are being communicated, notice that we can simulate this as follows. And we'll see how far we get by being on autopilot there, another feature of the staff's implementation. Let me go over to my terminal window inside of the appliance. I'm just inside of public HTML. And let me go ahead and run, I'm just going to create a file. And you can create files with the command touch foo.html. And if I now do ls-l, notice that I have already screwed up. Even though my other files in this directory are chmodded correctly, foo.html is only readable by me. And that's a problem if I want it actually to be accessible via a browser. So sure enough, if I go over to a browser, I reload, I can see it in my directory, because at this point in the story, my public HTML, I've actually given readability and executability permissions to with chmod. But if I click foo.html, you see the familiar forbidden message. And if you really look close in the title bar, you'll see that 403 forbidden does indeed somehow relate to chmod. But because we're now looking underneath the hood, let me also click on Firebug. So recall that that's the free plugin at top right. Let me go ahead and click here and reload, but with Firebug's net tab selected. So in the past, we've played with HTML. You might have played with others. But know that these other several tabs, including console and net and more, are all quite helpful. And you can see in red here that we tried to get foo.html, but it just didn't work. In fact, if I click on that, I can see a sort of user-friendly, nice bold-faced and grayscale version of the headers. But if I click View Source over here, this shows me the actual HTTP headers that were sent. And whereas 200 we said was good, 403 or really almost anything other than 200 is bad. And this is how websites are communicating that information. OK, Safari is getting lonely. So let's go back to Safari. And time is up. So that's a feature 2 of the staff's implementation. So this is just to point out that underneath all your typical web usage, there's some additional, somewhat arcane information that we programmatically are now going to have more control over with this language called JavaScript. All right, so without further ado, here is where you can learn about JavaScript. This is actually a really nice tutorial, but this, much like PHP, is really going to be a bootstrapping process where today and in yesterday's walkthrough and this week's sections, we'll be introduce you to the fundamentals, some of the concepts and the like. But ultimately, it will be up to you with the psets and with your final project to explore further. And this is one particular language guide that points out that JavaScript is actually pretty familiar. So just as with C and with PHP, we have functions. But as with PHP, you don't strictly need a main function anymore. If you want to start writing code, all you'll need, we'll see, is an HTML tag called script. So main won't be necessary, but functions will still be at our disposal. We'll see that conditions syntactically look again exactly like this. This was pseudocode from week 1. We stole it 2 weeks ago for PHP. It's exactly the same in JavaScript for conditions, for Boolean expressions, for switches, for loops, for while loops, for do-while loops, and yet more. So we only start to see some differences with JavaScript as follows. So variables have a slightly different syntax. You do not specify their type, just like in PHP. But unlike PHP, there's no $sign anymore. So it's actually a little more succinct. But you do need to say in JavaScript, generally, var for variable. And so this one line of code means give me a variable s and assign it a value of quote unquote hello world. Because it is quoted in this way, this will be an implicit data type of string. So JavaScript does have data types of sorts, but you don't need to explicitly mention them. So here we have a variable s, as we've had many times before. Now arrays, and this is where JavaScript gets interesting and frankly powerful and convenient, because syntactically it makes a lot of things easier. If we want an array called numbers, I just say var numbers. I don't specify in advance that it's an array, but rather I determine as much by assigning it an actual array. And in JavaScript, if you want an array, in this case of integers, all you need to do is do open square bracket, close square bracket, and then a comma-separated list of the numbers that you actually want to store in this array. You don't have to preordain its size. You don't have to call malloc. You don't even have to call PHP's array function. If you want an array, you can simply use the square bracket notation, and voila, you're on your way. Moreover, arrays in JavaScript are what we generally call vectors. They are not arrays in the C sense. They're more arrays in the PHP sense in that they can be resized. You can add more things to them. You can subtract things from them. And there's none of this headache of malloc and realloc and the like. The size, the length of an array will grow dynamically. And then we have some new constructs too. So recall that in PHP, we introduced a for each construct, which you might have found or may find useful. In JavaScript, there's something similar. It's the for element in array syntax. So if you've got an array called array, and you want to have a temporary variable called element, or foo, or bar, or whatever, you simply say for, and then in parentheses, local variable in array's name. And that will, on every iteration, just as in PHP's for each construct, update on each iteration the value of element to be the next thing in that array. And so that's just a handy and popular construct. But perhaps by far the most powerful or most frequently used feature of JavaScript these days is its notation for objects. So indeed, this technology we'll start talking about today called AJAX has really been popularized through the use of something called JavaScript Object Notation, otherwise known as JSON. And this is simply a syntax whereby you can declare an object with the simplest of characters. If you want an object, think back to C, like a struct, and you want that structure to have 3 fields, let's call it ID and house and name, all you have to do is open this object with a curly brace, close it with a curly brace and semicolon, and then inside of it you can have as many key value pairs as you want, all separated by commas, where the key is to the left of the colon and the value is to the right of the colon. So again, think back to our declaration of student with a type def and a struct way back in C. Well, this is the exact same idea, but if you want it to be declared, it's as simple as just saying, give me an object, call it student, and inside of it here are going to be these 3 key value pairs. Now to be clear, what is an object? Well, an object in JavaScript will eventually take on even more meaning than we'll look at today, in that it can have functions inside of it and the like. JavaScript is an object-oriented programming language, even though it doesn't have something called classes, with which some of you might be familiar. But this here allows us to encapsulate inside of some big variable multiple data fields. And so in this way, are we going to be able to format data and exchange data, especially over the internet, particularly easily. For instance, this is just one student object. It's not all that interesting in a vacuum. But if you actually wanted to have an array of students, we might say var students equals, and then open square bracket, because recall that denotes here comes an array. At the bottom, we have another closed square bracket, so that's the end of the array. And then inside of it, we, again, as promised, have a comma-separated list of something. But in this case, the something is an actual object. So the curly brace means here comes an object. Here's a key value, key value, key value, and then the same thing here for Tommy. And so now we have this very clean syntax, arguably, for kind of bundling up lots of information, still semantically tagging it so that I'm not just sending the number 123 Matherhouse David Malan, but rather I'm associating some metadata with it, these keys that just tell me, the receiver, what these pieces of data actually are. And notice, too, I don't have to mention any notion of data type here. These are very, very generic objects. Notice there is no mention of student with a capital S, no mention of an actual struct name or type def or object. Rather, these are really generic objects. So for better or for worse, JavaScript's notation allows us to very easily bundle up together lots of pieces of data like this. But once we now have these basics, it's more fun and it's more compelling to actually now start using these basic new syntactic features and this client-side language like JavaScript. So without further ado, let me go ahead and open up, let's say, this past example here. This was a very, very simple snippet of HTML from a while back. And it was nice just because it has some basic building blocks. A HTML tag, head, a title, a body, and then two tags inside of it, one of which had an attribute. And recall that we drew this thing like a picture, with a picture like this. And what did we call this tree-like structure? Anyone recall? Yeah, DOM. OK, I heard someone with Steph whispering it over here. So DOM, Document Object Model. And that's just a fancy way of saying that if you were a computer or a browser reading this HTML from a text file into RAM, how might you represent it? Well, you could just represent it as a huge string. But if you actually want to do interesting things with this web page and manipulate parts of it, add content, subtract content, well, you would instead want to be able to traverse it hierarchically like this picture here suggests. So this is what really happens when you download a web page with a browser and it contains HTML like this. One of the first things the browser does is it parses it. It analyzes that HTML code top to bottom, left to right. And every time it sees a tag, it creates what we'll call a node, one of these rectangles on the screen here. And every time it encounters another open tag inside of an already open tag, it assumes that that new node or that new rectangle is a child or some kind of descendant of the previously open tag. So in short, with the right logic and with the right code, can you read this file top to bottom, left to right, and just call the equivalent of malloc, 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 and wire these things together, much like you did in pset 6, a hash table or a tree or a trie or any of these data structures that were somehow interesting in memory. So what's neat about JavaScript is that you have the ability now programmatically to change what was sent to the user. So even though you might send them that HTML, you can keep sending them more HTML. Or you can keep sending them, we'll see, JSON data, and then add more and more content to the screen, or even remove it, right? Case in point, Facebook, right? Now with the news feed on the front page, you can constantly see new status updates, and you don't even have to click anything. It will just tell you when some new status updates are available, or you see a little pop-up in one of the corners of the screen. Well, how is that? Well, obviously, Facebook can't foretell the future. When you download the homepage for the first time at like 12 o'clock, well, they don't know what new status updates are going to come, and they don't want you, sort of 1990s style, to have to reload the whole page. And so they push additional updates to you in some manner. So they send you more HTML or more JSON type data so that their own JavaScript that came with the original web page can read it from the internet and then insert it more into the web page. And I would be remiss